11 days out. 39 states have early voting in person, and we're seeing big turnout. 35 million people have now voted. That comprises 1 out of 5 of the 2020 voting electorate. 49 states have some kind of early voting going. I've told you that with mail. It adds up. And there's one thing holding steady. The race is tied in the states that matter. Now, there are many headlines today about the final New York Times poll of this race, which also shows a national tie, a dead heat. And the final Times poll is something of a tradition. Campaigns and campaign junkies discuss this poll, though you won't have much to discuss if you think it's just deadlocked. So what does it mean? Well, it's a close race, as we've reported for some time. This is not the kind of gap where these polls will give you a lot that's useful. Sometimes polls basically show such big gaps that they reflect something. Take this time period in the Reagan re-election, just as an example. We checked today. He was about 20 points ahead in several polls at this time in '84. It was the kind of lead that reflected a landslide. He then won by 49 states. That's kind of the opposite of the case right now, where I'm telling you, or reminding you if you already know, a battery of polls shows such a close race that any swing within the margin of error could hand a victory to either candidate. So polls with big gaps tell you something, but tied polls tell you very little. If Dems see a tie and panic and Republicans see a tie and declare an early victory, that probably tells you more about their mood or their emotional tendencies than the actual numbers. Now, Trump is doing the Manhattan rally I mentioned. It's a blue state where there's a lot more Dems voting early. Harris going to that red state with Beyonce, her first appearance for Harris, who previously went to Beyonce's tour and then adopted her anthem Freedom at rallies. In Texas, over 3 million people have already voted. But it is only a political coincidence that both candidates are entering that opposing turf right now.
On Sunday, Donald Trump will hold a rally at Madison Square Garden. Yeah, just what New Yorkers need, more garbage around Penn Station. So, what the hell is Trump thinking about campaigning in New York? They told me I'm behind in Wisconsin, so I'm rallying in Madison Square Garden. It works. No, it works. Logically, it works.
That's how some of it's playing out on late night. The Texas appearance also draws attention to what the Harris campaign sees as a winning issue for her, how Republicans in that state have conducted extreme abortion crackdowns.
Women have died because of these bans, including a young mother of a 6-year-old son right here in Georgia. Her family is here with us tonight, and we speak her name, Amber Nicole Thurman. And you all have heard me say, look, I do believe Donald Trump to be an unserious man, and the consequences of him ever being president again are brutally serious.
Harris hammering an issue that for many voters is top of mind: abortion, women's rights, and what comes next. Now, Obama was at that rally, and he invoked his own credibility as a commander-in-chief to discuss the bombshell news rocking the Trump campaign.
The other day, General John Kelly, Donald Trump's former chief of staff, said that Trump told him he wanted his generals to be like Hitler's generals.
But certainly, the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
In politics, a good rule of thumb is don't say you want to do anything like Hitler. Now, I happen to know John Kelly and Mark Miller. They served under me when I was commander-in-chief. These are serious people.
I'm trying to imagine a chairman of the Joint Chiefs telling you that a former president is a fascist and a danger to this country is just inconceivable.
Well, and then
He proved it.
The reason they're speaking up is because they have seen that in Donald Trump's mind, the military does not exist to serve the Constitution. He thinks the military exists to do his bidding, to serve his interests.
President Obama on offense there on those important issues last night. And remember, Trump has owned all kinds of controversial claims on immigration or being a dictator on day one. His campaign sees the Hitler story as too damaging to admit. Donald Trump and his aides are denying it, basically arguing Kelly is just some sort of disgruntled liar. And I will tell you, there are times in campaigns or news where a story has two sources or sides just debating it out. It can be kind of contested, like a jump ball. This is not that kind of story. We have overwhelming public evidence that Trump did make these outrageous Hitler dictatorial statements. We have his own plans and vows to abuse government power if he gets it. And we have witnesses that back up Kelly. 13 more, in fact, signing an open letter, backing up the general, joining the warnings. These are not random critics. These are not even just Republicans. These are people Trump picked who served and worked with Kelly. They stand on a record. They are not known for randomly lying or accusing people of fascism. The warnings come as Trump makes his own vows about what he would do out of the authoritarian playbook. We know he was caught trying to overthrow the last election. And October is a time when more people tend to follow politics and news. We actually have data on that. So what might sound familiar to news viewers, maybe even to you, is now being discussed and covered as a potentially new or with more detail for those people. That's how it's supposed to work. That's why, probably, I can tell you, reasonably, Trump and his folks are denying this rather than admitting it because they're worried people are going to find out about it. And Hitler ain't a good closing argument in any American campaign, even on the right. And this comes against the backdrop of a wider double standard, you may have noticed, when it comes to Trump and Harris. Reading from the Washington Post, I can tell you, political and media elites seem to bake into this campaign Trump's allowed to talk and act like a complete lunatic, Eugene Robinson writes, while Harris has to be perfect in every way. Or take Obama veteran Van Jones, who this week said it's a double standard where Trump gets to be lawless and Harris has to be flawless. Now, a very popular radio host, you've probably heard of this campaign cycle, Charlemagne, who just interviewed Harris, he's actually raised a similar point with evidence, and it's making the rounds this week, and it matters. And he's arguing the double standard goes well beyond just conservative outlets like Fox. He called out CNN on air over this in a discussion with Anderson Cooper, an exchange that raised some important points and did so quite candidly. And so we're going to air a longer bit of that right now in context.
He's showing us who he is every single day.
Yeah, which is a fascist. And it's crazy because you still don't have news networks having that conversation. Yeah. Like when somebody says, when somebody questions Kamala Harris's blackness or is he a DEI hire, y'all will have roundtable discussions about that, asking that question. How come you're not having roundtable discussions asking, is Donald Trump a fascist? Actually not even asking it, stating it. I mean, when you look at the things that he's talking about doing, jailing journalists, jailing his political opponents, turning the military on American citizens.
Do you think she needs to do more of that? You know, Trump's going to go. Apparently,
yes.
Apparently, Trump's going on is going to tape a thing with Joe Rogan. Do you think she should do that?
I think that she should keep calling Donald Trump a fascist. A guy can say he wants to terminate the Constitution to overthrow the results of an election, and nobody cares.
And
like even me bringing it up now, you brought it back to Kamala and Joe Rogan. Anderson,
yeah,
who gives a damn? That rhetoric doesn't scare people.
Well, we talk about this every single. This is what
I don't think
I've been talking about this every night.
I don't think y'all have enough conversations about it. I feel like I heard more on this network about is Kamala Harris black than I do about Donald Trump being a fascist.
Well,
am I wrong, Angela?
Honestly, I'm sorry to say that we're sitting around discussing is Kamala Harris black. Like I've
seen that. I've seen those roundtable discussions a lot. Now that's true. Anderson, for you to say that y'all don't have those conversations. I saw last night they were talking about, the double standard that exists between Donald Trump and the vice president. But it's always a double standard with Trump, whether it's with Hillary, whether it's, against Biden, now with Kamala. We talk about him being a threat to democracy, but we don't treat him like one.
We need to treat threats seriously. And if someone tells you they admire Hitler for certain things and they want generals like Hitler, yes, America, we need to assess and absorb that before we make this big decision. And there are top conservatives who not only oppose Trump, but have left the Republican Party since Trump hijacked it. They say and warn this is a long way from the party of Reagan. So tonight, with that in mind, compare how Reagan, who was very conservative, described America to what Donald Trump is telling you what he thinks of you and America just last night.
I thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here.
They're coming from 181 countries as of yesterday. Right, and we're a dumping ground. We're like a garbage can for the world. That's what's happened. That's what's happened to our. We're like a garbage can.
Are we like a garbage can? Are our doors open within the rules and the right ethic and the right ability and reason to work? Or do we think we are a garbage can? Or do we think that we're being told things that are actually revealing? Listen to what the candidates say. Listen to what they think of you and our country and our rules and our Constitution and our rule of law. And listen to what they say they're going to do. Because a lot of the time, they mean it.
Democracy in darkness. That's the slogan of the newspaper, The Washington Post. It is the first thing on the top of their homepage, and if you still get a print copy, it's on their newspapers too. Their reporters embody that slogan through their relentless and crucial and fearless reporting, whether it be their extensive work uncovering the horror of the January 6th attack on the Capitol in their backyard and Donald Trump's role in it that earned the Post the Pulitzer Prize for public service, or the reporting today that we spent the better part of an hour talking about Donald Trump's former chief of staff telling the Washington Post directly about his concerns that the ex-president would use the U.S. military against American citizens on U.S. soil. The work of the Washington Post has been elevated here, not that they need it, but it's been essential, especially when it comes to highlighting the threat that Donald Trump poses to democracy and to the First Amendment. In the backdrop of all of that, the Washington Post editorial board made a stunning decision today that for the first time in 36 years, the Washington Post editorial board will not endorse a candidate for president. Washington Post CEO Will Lewis writes this about the non-endorsement today, quote, "We see it as consistent with the values the Post has always stood for and what we hope for in a leader. Character and courage in service to the American ethic, veneration for the rule of law, and respect for human freedom in all its aspects." I don't even know what that means, so thank goodness. Joining our conversation, NPR media correspondent David Folkenflik here. He broke this story about the Washington Post this morning. David, before we start, let me just play for you the person who I think most Americans most often associate with the journalism of the Washington Post.
Well, you know, he will say things and do things. Again, maybe it's possible if he became president. One thing I have learned from writing about 10 presidents, as I said, going back to Nixon, is the extraordinary concentration of power in that office. A president can almost do anything. As we see daily, something comes up that really doesn't relate to presidential power, and reporters, our colleagues, will ask the White House, what does the president say? What is the position of the White House on this? So count to 10. The country better count to 10 before they think about putting Trump back in power. It would, it's not political, it's not personal, it's organizational collapse. Is this what people want? People who are business people who run organizations or in organizations know the chaos that can be created if there's no plan and there are no group of people working together. That's the promise of the Trump presidency.
So they may not have endorsed, but we'll play that every day until the election if we have to. Your understanding of how this came to be?
Sure. From what I'm told from three people with knowledge inside the Post, direct knowledge, the editor of the editorial pages, David Shipley, had approved the directions of a draft editorial endorsing Kamala Harris. And, essentially said, well, I got to take this up to the big boss. And that means Jeff Bezos, of course, the founder of Amazon, the owner in total of the Washington Post. Now, this isn't a break with tradition. This is a common practice. Publishers and owners get a role in this. It's not an interference per se. It's prerogative. However, for the owner to decide not to endorse so close to Election Day is really a stunning move. It's particularly stunning in light of the recent history of the Post. In many ways, Bezos, despite all of his wealth, he's one of the world's richest people, but also one of the most important business figures in the United States. For all of his interests, has been heretofore an essentially exemplary owner, not interfering with coverage of his own business interests or political interests at all. In 2016, the then publisher, Fred Ryan, didn't really want the paper to endorse Hillary Clinton, which seemed likely at the time. The editorial page editor at the time, Fred Hyatt, considered resigning. Jeff Bezos' response is, why wouldn't we endorse? This was a race between whom? Well, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, whom the Post already had grave reservations about. Since then, the Post, of course, has done crusading reporting from its news team about, just as you highlighted so deftly, about Trump's role in office, often uncovering accused improprieties and alleged wrongdoings by then President Trump and his circle. And the editorial page, which of course is run separately, has so often argued that since then that Trump has been proven unfit for office, particularly in light of what happened in January 2021. Well, Shipley came back this morning at his 11 o'clock meeting to tell his editorial board, in fact, what he had known for some days, which is that Bezos had vetoed that and said that there would be no editorial endorsement from the Post. And it just set off, a firestorm inside that newsroom. And you've seen to a great degree online and in person outside the newsroom as well.
Can I show you what Donald Trump said yesterday about journalists and the press?
Sure.
They're just bad people. And until we get a fair and free press in this country, they're just bad people. They're the enemy of the people. They are. They're the enemy of the... I've been asked not to say it. I don't want to say it. They're the enemy of the people. And someday they're not going to be the enemy of the people, I hope.
I don't know Jeff Bezos, but what it looks like is call and response. Donald Trump telling them not to be bad, and Jeff Bezos saying, sir, yes, sir.
And I did a story about this very question yesterday, before even this played out at the Post, but acknowledging there was some trepidation within the Post that Bezos might reach this decision. And that is the question of whether there's some sort of preemptive self-censorship. Trump, after all, running 50-50, essentially, with Kamala Harris for the presidential race that will play out in less than 2 weeks. And Trump has, both in light of what his actions were in government, which were often attempting to wound the parent companies or the owners of those media outlets that he deemed insufficiently respectful. He intervened to try to block the takeover of CNN's parent company by AT&T. He intervened, the Defense Department allegedly intervened to block Amazon receiving a multi-billion-dollar contract with the Defense Department. Ultimately, it was forced to give Amazon part of the contract, even though it had sought to give all of it to Microsoft. So you've seen that he's willing to do that. Well, just as you've highlighted for viewers just now, on the campaign trail in 2022, he said he would jail reporters who refused to share confidential sources for government leaks. And this year, he's been saying time and again he wanted to punish the three broadcast networks, CBS, ABC, NBC, for various perceived elements of coverage or moderating debates or fact-checking or other things that he thought were disrespectful to him. Well, ultimately, he can't take away the network's broadcast licenses, but he could try to gum up the works for the 80 local stations that those three networks own between them. And what he's really indicating is directionally, I'm willing to exact vengeance on those who cover me in ways I don't like. It is hard for many folks inside the Washington Post that I've spoken to over the last 24 hours, and particularly in the last 5 hours, to disassociate those threats from what they've seen play out today, given Bezos's myriad billion-dollar interests before the federal government right now.
Chris, first of all, fascinating. The Wall Street Journal editorial page, once again, mocking people who are concerned about Donald Trump, saying that he's going to round up political prisoners, that he's going to round up his political opponents, that he's going to use the Army, he's going to use the National Guard to arrest, quote, enemies within, that a general, a four-star general who was, of course, Donald Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, saying that Donald Trump is a fascist, that Donald Trump's last chairman of the Joint Chiefs said Donald Trump was a fascist to the core, and somehow the Wall Street Journal editorial page mocking Democrats and playing the Fuhrer card. How fascinating that they would say that. Who's playing the card? Earlier this week, they talked about the fascist meme, despite the fact, again, days after Donald Trump is saying that he's going to use the military and the National Guard to go after enemies from within. And he listed the former Democratic Speaker of the House and the future Democratic Senator from California. It's absolutely fascinating. They're writing this while Donald Trump's calling America a garbage can. He's called America a stupid country, while Donald Trump and other Republicans are trashing four-star generals that don't support Donald Trump. Chris, you and I have been at this for a very long time. It's, I've got to say, it's hard to be shocked, but not surprised after all these years. But I've got to say, I really am. I really am at how numb they have grown to even the most outrageous remarks of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's so clear, Joe, that, and Mika, that this election has come down to the clear talking points of both candidates, though. Certainly, the Democratic Party and people concerned about Trump are worried about his horrific statements. And, of course, Trump is talking about immigration. Immigration will become a garbage dump. There are people coming in this country at will. You know, it's amazing to do what I spent yesterday, which is going through my old neighborhood right on the edge with Bucks County, right in Philadelphia, near the edge with Bucks County. That's sort of the dividing line politically. Our neighborhood is every other house is Republican or Democrat. I walked around with the ward leader, Jim Donnelly, and the state senator, Jim Dillon, and you could tell how alternate houses are very much different in their views. I mean, there's certainly no doubt that race plays a role in this campaign. I mean, people don't say it. It's there. It's part of our history, going back to the 15th Amendment, going back to the 19th Amendment, with women being able to vote. It's there. The people in those houses that I grew up with, where I used to serve the bulletin to, the newspaper, are facing and being history. History is what they're going to make in this election, not just the news. They talk about what we talk about on the air. They're very aware of what's going on. They're talking about the issues about immigration, about the fascist charge against Trump. It's all there, but also history. Women being able to vote since 1920 with suffrage, are they going to vote separately than men? Apparently so. The gap is fantastic, the gender gap between men and women. Young men will vote very differently than older men. So even in the same neighborhoods, with kids coming home and me coming home to my old house where I grew up in, it's amazing to become having our close-up in history at the edge of Bucks County in Philadelphia, deciding history. And it's going to decide history because all of history in Pennsylvania is very easy to figure out. Hillary blew it, fairly or not. She didn't go to Erie. She didn't go to Wilkes-Barre. This weekend, you'll love this, Mika, Christine Baranski is up campaigning in Wilkes-Barre this last weekend, our old Polish neighborhood. And it's so important for people to go back to their old neighborhoods. I really say, movie stars, don't put out press releases in Hollywood. Go to your old neighborhood where you grew up and talk to the people about what it was like growing up, and then tell them your politics. It's very important to communicate it properly, and I don't think the Philadelphia people are going to blow it, because the city organization of the Democratic ward leaders, all 67 of them, are all working and pounding their feet for this election. You've got the labor unions are in there, all heavily, very big for the Democrats, and you've got a lot of college kids around the country coming in there, helping out all over the state. Different places. They're kind of keeping it secret, I know, but the fact is they're really working hard, all the levels. So the Democrats will not be surprised in this election like they were in 16. This is an election where they're going to have to win it. They're going to have to see the enemy coming, knowing their neighbors are among their enemies in the sense of politics, and they got to work really hard to win this thing.
Just politics, and after this is over, both sides are going to have to figure out a way to come back together. That's going to be extraordinarily difficult. Molly, I'm curious. Chris kept bringing up 2016, and there's no doubt that people that are working on the Harris campaign right now still haunted by the specter of 2016. But as Chris said, Kamala Harris taking nothing for granted, not taking Pennsylvania for granted, not taking Erie for granted, not taking Michigan for granted, not taking Wisconsin for granted. The question is, will it make a difference?
Well, that's the big question. But, you know, I was in Wilmington and I was talking to them, and they are, you know, everyone is always like, in the Hillary campaign, in the Harris campaign, they want you to think that they're losing. Right? They have taken a totally different tact. They really want everyone to be worried. They want everyone to be out there. And I think that's a lesson they've gotten from 2016, right?
And by the way, for people that are like laughing right now, that might tell, oh, come on, they're just whistling. You know, they know how much trouble they're in. I will tell you, every time I ran campaigns, the thing that drove me crazy, and the few times that people saw me like show my temper, was when people started walking around saying, hey, I hear we're 3 points ahead. I would turn around and go, we are losing by 10 points. Now get out and knock in precinct 47, because we're going to lose this race.
And everyone you talk to in that campaign says, it's going to be tight. We'd rather be us than them. That's what they always say. And, you know, she's going, like, even the fact that she's going to Pittsburgh instead of Philly, right? These are choices. And she is going to go to Philly, too, and she has. But, like, these are choices. And I think they've done a lot of really smart stuff. They've got Bill Clinton out there in the South. They've got Obama out there. They've got Michelle out there. I mean, there really is just a sort of very thoughtful campaign, spending a ton of money. They have $1 billion. Look, we don't know what's going to happen, but it will not be because there was some huge blind spot they missed.
Meanwhile, I mean, certainly also the Harris team has an advantage when it comes to the field operations and ground game. If this is indeed a turnout election, just simply actually getting people to the polls that, you know, 2 Tuesdays from now, that might be an advantage to Harris, who has a far better organization even than the Trump people know. And that's the one area the Trump folks have gotten very confident, but they will acknowledge that's their weakness, is that those field operations. So, Doug, talk to us, though. One thing that Trump is trying to do is just create spectacles, you know, with his comments overnight talking about America as a garbage can, the stunt last week at McDonald's. He's going on Joe Rogan today, and he's even having a rally at Madison Square Garden on Sunday. Of course, Deep Blue City, where he got like 5% of the vote in 2020. But he wants the images of the crowd, and he knows the media won't be able to resist.
Absolutely. Well, you know, for Donald Trump right now, every moment he just wants his name talked about. He'll say the craziest, most bizarre thing just to gaslight the nation, but have the conversation being about Trump. You know, I'm surprised he's had the stamina this far. He often seems exhausted and tired to me, but he seems to keep going over there. It's helped him that he had the MAGA gear, you know, already in place, like kind of sticking to the old playbook. Musk brought him the dark MAGA. Probably Musk is has been Trump's most effective surrogate. But this is down to the wire, and I just don't think that we've seen an election that people's nerves are like this right now, because for a lot of people, Trump equals the end of democracy as we know it.
Now there'll be people who will say that's hyperbolic. The Wall Street
know it.
The Wall Street Journal editorial page knows exactly what Donald Trump is doing, and yet they're trying to make it about somebody else. They're trying to make it about, oh, people on the left are hysterical. No. Liz Cheney's not on the left.
Yeah.
Liz Cheney's more conservative than a lot of people that write on that editorial page. And Liz Cheney will be the first to tell you that a democracy, American democracy, the constitutional republic will change dramatically, will change radically if Donald Trump is elected president of the United States. You have generals who served this country who are saying the same thing. You have a lot of people that served with Donald Trump. A lot of people, again, it's hilarious. I guess they think they can cow people into not saying it, or maybe give a permission structure for people that read their pages to vote for a guy who's promising to be a fascist, who's promising to use the military against his political opponents. Maybe that's what they're trying to do. But let's not let them do that. Please tell me, have you ever heard of another presidential candidate at this stage of the campaign talking about using the military to arrest their political opponents and then continually pushing back also on a Murdoch-owned outlet to reporters and to talk show hosts who keep saying, well, you don't really mean that they're enemies of the state. You're not really going to use the Justice Department to arrest Nancy Pelosi, to arrest the next senator from California. You're not. And he goes, yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So please tell me if that's not a definition, or if that does not round out the definition of fascism, what does? Where do we get? When do we get to the tipping point for these people?
Well, it's an American-style fascism. Trump's supporters think it's a kind of a joke. I'll be a dictator day one. Well, it's not a joke. Nixon kept his enemies list. If Nixon could have stayed in there, he was starting to destroy reporters through the IRS and the like. In this case, Trump, if inaugurated, will probably find 10 or so major American figures to try to destroy. General Mark Milley, Dr. Fauci, the list is going to grow long, to send a broadband message that I am above the law, because the Supreme Court gave that immunity clause. It's a back to Nixon, to David Frost on BBC. If the president does it, it must be legal. Trump believes that in his soul. It comes right from Roger Stone's tattoo, transfers over to him, that line of Nixon. And, he has targets. Trump, Pelosi, top political one. He got under his skin too much. Well, this is no way to run a country, that we're talking about a new president coming in. We've already experienced January 6th, and now Trump's saying, I'll get inaugurated, and I'm going to send secret police or after these people, or destroy the Justice Department, or take our institutions, whether it's Environmental Protection Agency or Department of Education, and gut it. And we're looking at a bit of a strong arm. We've had these figures in American history, the Huey Longs and Joe McCarthy, Strom Thurmond's, right. But not as president, and not one that already oversaw an insurrection.
But Republicans now don't care about January the 6th. They say it's much ado about nothing. After the riots, after the attempted insurrection, and by the way, even people running Donald Trump's campaign after the insurrection called it an insurrection. But now, much ado about nothing. So what's going to happen if they arrest Nancy Pelosi, throw her in jail? How many Republicans are going to go, yeah, that's fine, because she said bad things about Donald Trump? What if he shuts down CBS News? And they'll go, yeah, they always were. But do we have any confidence that the people that have heard these threats are going to really give a damn when he starts rounding up people who have said tough things about him?
Does this signal to you the campaign believes that if they're going to reach that tiny sliver of undecided, the New York Times calls them immovable voters, abortion is their strongest play?
I don't think these voters are immovable, and I think abortion is really important. There's a group that doesn't get talked about a lot that we look at, which is kind of non-college white women. Probably they live in areas that are very MAGA. Their husbands are probably MAGA, but this is their first time to vote since Roe and since Dobbs. And could the vice president improve with non-college white women by 2-3 points? That could be decisive in a very close election. So I think it's good. One thing that I like, and it didn't show in that ad, but there's a separate ad that they're running about a Texas woman who wanted to have a baby, had a miscarriage, and she wasn't able to get the care that she needs, and now she might not be able to have a baby in the future. And I liked that ad in particular because it shows to me the Harris campaign is not just reaching out to pro-choice voters, but even trying to expand beyond that to pro-life voters that don't like the extremism of the law in Texas that has put women's lives at risk, right? And so if you look at 60% of the country says pro-choice, you have another 10% of voters that are pro-life but want reasonable exceptions, want reasonable laws. You get to a very popular issue that has a real impact on women's lives and on everyone's life.
Just tonight's event and then last night's event seemed to signal a return to these huge rallies. 23,000 plus last night in Georgia. I mean, they did have a lot of star power there. The Houston Stadium for tonight's rally, I think, holds roughly that many. Then you have Trump going to Madison Square Garden on Sunday. That holds about 20,000 people. My question is, it costs a lot of money. The logistics are difficult. What do all these big rallies buy them? Presumably, it's like the same amount of free media. Why?
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, first of all, Donald Trump has always been obsessed with crowd size. We know that. That's from the beginning. I think these big rallies are important because I think we're trying to break through the noise here, and we're trying to inspire people, and we're trying to reach people where they're at with messengers that they will listen to and that they will trust. And I think what you see from the campaigns is that they're trying to put as many people out there in these large-scale opportunities that generate a lot of media to have these dialogues. I mean, look, we're going to cover the campaign either way, but I think, this is a quick and efficient way to reach as many people as possible with these closing arguments that are so important. When you're in a dead heat, everything matters. Every little thing can make a difference here. And so I'm not surprised to see the campaign focused on doing what they can to reach as many people as possible. Every single vote matters here. And I know we talk about the battleground states, but everyone's vote matters here. The popular vote matters too. And it's important that they can reach as many people as possible. And it's hard to get everywhere. So they're doing the best they can with the time that they have. I mean, what Kamala Harris has been able to do in such a remarkable short amount of time is incredible. How she's coalesced everyone into this battle and into this fight. And I think they're closing strong. I think we're going to see lots of people. There's a lot of enthusiasm. Early votes showing a lot of enthusiasm. There are lots of volunteers in these battleground states. I was talking to a friend in Wisconsin. They said there were about 125 people just at the town she was in to volunteer to get out the vote. There's enthusiasm in these states. And so it doesn't surprise me that they want to spread this throughout the country as well.
So, Yamiche, you've got some more details about what to expect tonight at the rally. There has been all this buzz about Beyonce, Willie Nelson expected to be there. But what else? What are we going to see? What are we going to hear tonight?
Well, as you said, we do expect some big names like Beyonce and Willie Nelson to be here. But this is, of course, also a rally about freedom, which, of course, we know the vice president has been walking out to the song Freedom, which is by Beyonce for months now. She's going to be hammering home the idea, though, that she sees Texas as ground zero to the dangerous consequences of abortion restrictions. She's going to be out on stage with a number of women who say that they suffered life-threatening consequences because they were not given the proper care that they needed, either when they were miscarrying or when they needed an abortion or wanted an abortion, and as a result that they are sort of the face of what could happen to women across the country. So the vice president is going to be saying, while you think you might be safe in maybe Georgia or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, this could be coming to you, these abortion restrictions that we see here in Texas. So she's really going to be trying to connect this and make this a national event, not just focus on Texas, though she is trying to unseat Ted Cruz and helping Colin Allred, who's running against him. The other thing to note here is that she's going to be talking also about her to-do list. That to-do list includes, she says, passing reproductive freedom laws, restoring the protections of Roe v. Wade, but also cutting taxes, also providing home care and backing and support for people who need care in their homes, as well as for Medicare and other things. So she has a long to-do list, and she's going to be saying that Donald Trump has an enemy's list and she has a to-do list, Chris.
So, Tim, NBC News has learned that outside groups have spent roughly $1.1 billion in this campaign. That's obviously a new record with 11 days still to go. What kind of options does it give you than you would otherwise have, especially in the closing days of a campaign?
Yeah, look, I'm one that usually thinks, I think I'm different than most political consultants, probably because I'm not taking a vig on these ads. I think they have pretty much diminishing returns at this point. I think it's useful to get new arguments into the narrative at the presidential level, because people are hearing a lot about, and they're seeing these sorts of ads on TikTok, on YouTube, and in conversations. So I think it's important to kind of introduce new info. I think you're seeing the Harris campaign start to do that a little bit more. I think that she's in Texas right now. I should just say that some of that money would be pretty useful for Colin Allred right now, who I think could actually do more ads. He's running against Ted Cruz, and he's at a little bit of a financial disadvantage in a Senate seat that could be absolutely critical for the, for what is who has the majority in the Senate. And I think that the ground game is the other part of the finances at this point. Do you have the money to make sure you're paying to get all these boots on the ground? Many of them are volunteers, but you're paying for travel, you're paying for logistics, and you're making sure they're getting to the right doors and getting the right people out.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I went door to door with various groups, various campaigns, and they'll tell people, we'll give you a ride, and somebody says, we need a ride, and I always wonder if that person got the ride that they thought they were going to get. Anyway, right. Shaq, let me ask you, Donald Trump is headed to Michigan after the event in Texas today, and Arizona and Nevada. All those places, he has kept the focus squarely on immigration. Tell us more.
Yeah, and Chris, you can expect that focus on immigration to continue into this afternoon. In just about a half hour or so, we will see Donald Trump ahead of that podcast taping. And if you look at even just the signage on the stage, mass deportations now, end migrant crime, you get an idea that that focus on immigration will continue, at least at that event. And that is being paired with the escalating rhetoric that we've been hearing, not just the clip that you played at the beginning of this segment where he referenced or called America a dumping ground because of the issue of immigration. But you also heard at some rallies yesterday, he paused his remarks to play videos of what his campaign called migrant gangs. He repeated the claims that illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants are taking jobs of Black and Hispanic voters. So that is the messaging that you're going to continue to hear. But once we get to Michigan later today, there's a chance that it shifts a little bit. We've seen in the past, and his campaign has signaled that it might be more of an economic focus here, the economy, tariffs, talking about auto workers. That's something we've seen in the past, and where he's coming to today, this county is one where, if you look at the past two elections, he won this county, but he did lose some ground here. He won it by double digits in 2016. In 2020, he won it by just 3 percentage points. So I think if you want to know what he thinks that good closing message should be, especially in these Midwestern battleground states, tonight will be a good thing to watch, a good metric to use to see what that closing message will be as we come up on Election Day, Chris.
Jess, garbage can for the world. There are all sorts of new permutations, but the same kind of dehumanizing messages. And Trump talked about being angry. Is generating that kind of emotion in his base the goal? Is that the key for him, at least he thinks, in the closing days?
Yeah, sure. He's trying to rile up his base for sure. He's talked poorly about immigrants from the beginning of this thing. We've been dealing with Donald Trump now for almost 10 years. He started his very first campaign talking about this issue. We are a nation of immigrants. They add to our country culturally and economically. It is Republicans, and you can't run away from this. It's Republicans who torpedoed a bipartisan deal to actually try to move forward on this issue around pathways to citizenship, et cetera. So, this is all campaign rhetoric. This is all meant to rile people up and mainly to scare them. His entire campaign has been fear-based. This is a race to the bottom. And, I think we have an opportunity to turn the page here. I think a lot of people want want to do that. But this is going to be close. It's going to come down to every single vote, in this dead heat. And so he's going to use what he thinks is going to get his people out. I hope that, I hope that we have an opportunity to make some progress on this, because him and Republicans haven't wanted to move forward on this.
So we were showing Tim the podium, and that's where we're going to see Donald Trump a short time from now in Austin. But let me go back to Kamala Harris for a minute, because we talk about all these celebrities. She had them out last night. She's having Beyonce and Willie Nelson, obviously focused on probably two different kinds of audiences tonight. But when you look at the attention that gets, that a normal campaign event might not, whatever ends up on TikTok or YouTube, or the pictures that end up on Instagram, is it clear that there's a way to transfer that, just the views, the interest in an individual performer or celebrity, into encouraging somebody to get off the couch and go vote?
Well, yeah, because we're trying to think about who she's trying to reach right now, right? And we spend a lot of time. I'm always asked about one particular group, like the Nikki Haley Republicans. Given my past, that's usually higher income, high income, college educated Republicans that don't like Trump. So there's one way to reach them. She was out with Liz Cheney earlier this week. That's how she's trying to do it. The other group that she's trying to reach are people that are basically Democrats and would be likely to vote for Kamala Harris, but they're just not that tuned in to politics. And so I think that's why you had Eminem out, you had the Insane Clown Posse, you had Beyonce. I just think you're trying to pull out all the cards to say, hey, look, if this person has 50, I didn't look, but whatever it is, 50 million Instagram followers, she probably has more than that, who knows? Some of those people are people that aren't watching the news. They aren't getting news in their feed. And now they'll get a clip of Beyonce in their feed that might remind them, oh, I got to go vote tomorrow. So I like that. It's that group of people you're trying to reach with celebrities, people that are just not engaging in political news. And that's going to be an important group for the vice president's campaign in the last 10 days.
Beyonce's Instagram account has over 314 million followers, according to the
I sold her way short. I'm so sorry, Beyonce.
World
So sorry
Wide
about
Web.
that.